December 7, 1941. As Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto celebrated the stunning success at Pearl Harbor, he turned to his staff with confidence. The American Pacific Fleet lay crippled in the shallow waters of Hawaii. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Nearly 200 aircraft obliterated on the ground. But there was one element of American naval power that survived almost completely intact that day: the submarine force. The 51 submarines of the Pacific Fleet weren't at Pearl Harbor when the bombs fell. And Japanese naval commanders barely gave them a second thought. Why would they? In the opening months of the Pacific War, American submarines seemed to prove Japanese skepticism correct. Torpedoes ran too deep or failed to explode. Submarine commanders, trained in cautious peacetime doctrine, approached combat tentatively. Japanese convoys steamed across the Pacific virtually unmolested. Japanese Admiral Osamu Nagano scoffed at intelligence reports about American submarine capabilities. "Their submarines are a nuisance," he reportedly told staff officers. "Nothing more. They lack the warrior spirit to threaten our supply lines." But over the next 3.5 years, American submarines would wage the most devastating commerce war in naval history. They would sink over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping, more than half of Japan's entire merchant fleet. They would strangle Japan's island empire, cutting off the oil, rubber, and raw materials that fed its war machine. The submarine service would account for just 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel in the Pacific. But they would sink 55% of all Japanese ships destroyed during the war. This is the story of how American submarines transformed from a laughingstock into Japan's worst nightmare. The silent service that brought an empire to its knees. When war broke out, the United States submarine force possessed one of the most advanced underwater fleets in the world. The fleet submarines like the Gato class could dive to 300 feet, cruise for thousands of miles, and carried 24 torpedoes each. On paper, these submarines should have devastated Japanese shipping from day one. Instead, they embarrassed themselves. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary American submarine weapon, was plagued with catastrophic defects that wouldn't be fully understood for nearly 2 years. Submariners reported again and again. Torpedoes running underneath targets. Torpedoes hitting but failing to explode. Torpedoes that detonated prematurely, alerting the enemy without causing damage. Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton of the USS Wahoo watched in frustration during an early patrol as torpedo after torpedo failed. He maneuvered his boat into perfect firing position against a Japanese transport. Range, 1,200 yards. Angle on the bow, 90 degrees. A textbook setup. He fired 4 torpedoes. 3 ran underneath the target. The 4th hit but failed to detonate. The Japanese transport steamed away, completely unaware it had been attacked. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was standard operating procedure for American submarines in 1942. But faulty torpedoes weren't the only problem. The submarine force itself was hamstrung by outdated doctrine and cautious leadership. Pre-war submarine commanders had been trained for fleet operations, shadowing enemy battle groups, attacking warships, supporting the main battle line. Aggressive commerce raiding against merchant ships was considered ungentlemanly, even piratical. Many early submarine skippers approached combat like they were still on peacetime maneuvers. They made cautious approaches, often from maximum range. They fired single torpedoes to conserve ammunition. They dove at the first sign of escorts, abandoning attacks entirely. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, received patrol report after patrol report describing missed opportunities and overly conservative tactics. One submarine returned from patrol having fired only 4 of its 24 torpedoes. Another spent 6 weeks on station and never fired a single shot. A third commander broke off an attack because the sea state was too rough for accurate torpedo work. Meanwhile, Japanese convoys moved freely across the Pacific, delivering the oil from the Dutch East Indies and raw materials from Southeast Asia that kept Japan's war machine running. In Tokyo, Japanese naval planners breathed easier. Intelligence reports confirmed what they suspected. American submarines posed minimal threat to Japanese supply lines. Monthly shipping losses to submarine attack in early 1942 barely reached 50,000 tons. Japan was building merchant ships almost as fast as Americans were sinking them. Admiral Nagano's assessment seemed vindicated. The American submarine force lacked the skill, the aggression, and the warrior spirit to threaten Japan's maritime lifeline. But changes were coming. Changes that would transform the American submarine force from a dysfunctional embarrassment into the most lethal commerce raiding force in naval history. And Japanese admirals would have no idea what was about to hit them. The turning point. By mid-1942, Admiral Charles Lockwood had taken command of American submarine operations in the Pacific. Lockwood was a submariner's admiral. He had commanded boats himself, understood their capabilities, and most importantly, he listened to his commanders when they reported problems. And there were problems to report. Lockwood initiated systematic testing of the Mark 14 torpedo. What his testing crews discovered was shocking. The torpedoes ran an average of 10 feet deeper than their depth settings. When set to run at 10 feet, the perfect depth to hit a ship's waterline, they actually ran at 20 feet, passing harmlessly. The magnetic exploder, designed to detonate the torpedo underneath a ship's keel where the explosion would break the vessel's back, was so sensitive it often detonated prematurely or not at all. And the contact exploder, the backup detonation system, was so poorly designed that a direct, perpendicular hit would crush the firing mechanism before it could trigger the explosion. In other words, American submarines had been going to war with a weapon that only worked reliably when conditions were absolutely perfect. And conditions in combat are never perfect. Lockwood began systematically fixing these problems. He ordered depth settings adjusted. He authorized commanders to deactivate the magnetic exploder. Eventually, after months of bureaucratic fighting, he forced the torpedo factory to redesign the contact exploder. But perhaps more importantly, Lockwood began replacing cautious commanders with aggressive ones. Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton took command of the USS Wahoo in mid-1942, and he brought with him a completely different philosophy of submarine warfare. Morton didn't believe in cautious approaches from maximum range. He drove Wahoo directly into enemy convoys, attacking from close range where his torpedoes couldn't miss. He didn't fire single torpedoes. He fired spreads of 4 or 6, saturating the target area. He didn't dive at the first sign of escorts. He stayed on the surface when possible, using Wahoo's superior speed and maneuverability to outfight Japanese subchasers. On Wahoo's third patrol under Morton's command, he took the boat into the shallow, confined waters of Wewak Harbor off New Guinea. Intelligence reported a Japanese convoy sheltering there. Traditional doctrine said submarines should never enter confined harbors. No room to maneuver. No room to dive deep. Escape routes limited. It was a death trap. Morton took Wahoo in anyway. What followed was one of the most audacious submarine attacks of the war. Over the course of several hours, Wahoo torpedoed and sank a destroyer and 3 cargo ships totaling over 20,000 tons. When Japanese escorts finally cornered Wahoo in the shallow harbor, Morton surfaced and fought his way out with deck guns blazing. Wahoo's patrol report became required reading for every submarine commander in the Pacific. Here was proof that aggressive tactics worked, that submarines could dominate the enemy rather than simply harassing them. In late 1943, another submarine joined the Pacific Fleet that would become legendary, USS Tang, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane. O'Kane had served as executive officer on Wahoo under Mush Morton, learning aggressive tactics from the master. When he took command of Tang, he brought Morton's philosophy with him, but refined it with systematic precision. O'Kane was aggressive, but never reckless. He planned each attack meticulously, positioning Tang for maximum advantage before firing. He trained his crew relentlessly until every man could perform his duties blindfolded. And he had something Morton never had, torpedoes that actually worked. Tang's first patrol took her to the waters around Truk, Japan's major naval base in the Caroline Islands. Over the course of 49 days, Tang sank 5 Japanese ships totaling 27,000 tons. Her second patrol was even more successful. 6 ships sunk, 31,000 tons. By her third patrol, Japanese convoy commanders dreaded Tang's hunting grounds. O'Kane had developed a reputation for appearing where Japanese ships felt safest, in shallow coastal waters, in supposedly mine channels, even in harbor approaches. Nowhere was safe when Tang was on patrol. The fleet expands. But it wasn't just individual boats like Wahoo and Tang that were changing the game. The entire submarine fleet was expanding rapidly. In 1942, the United States had fewer than 60 fleet submarines operating in the Pacific. By the end of 1943, that number had grown to over 100. By mid-1944, nearly 150 American submarines prowled the Pacific, and more were arriving every month. The shipyards at Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire were launching New Gatto and Below-class submarines at a rate of nearly 2 per week. Each submarine carried 24 torpedoes. Each could stay on patrol for 60 to 75 days. Each could cover thousands of square miles of ocean. And now, finally, their torpedoes worked. Japanese merchant captains began reporting what they called phantom submarines. American boats that seemed to be everywhere at once. A convoy would be attacked off Formosa. 6 hours later, another convoy 200 miles away would be hit. The next day, shipping near the Philippines would come under fire. It seemed impossible that so many submarines could be operating in Japanese-controlled waters. But they were, and they were just getting started.
Japans Achilleshiel.
To understand why American submarines became so devastatingly effective, you have to understand Japan's fundamental strategic vulnerability. Japan is a small island nation with virtually no natural resources. No oil,
No rubber.
limited iron ore, almost no aluminum or other strategic metals. Every gallon of fuel that powered Japanese aircraft came from oil fields in the Dutch East Indies or Borneo. Every tire on every vehicle came from rubber plantations in Malaya and French Indochina. Every bullet, every shell, every piece of military equipment required raw materials imported from Japan's conquered territories in Southeast Asia. Japan's entire war-making capability depended on merchant ships, tankers hauling oil from the East Indies, freighters bringing rubber from Malaya, or carriers transporting metals from China and Korea. Admiral Yamamoto understood this vulnerability. Before the war, he had warned Japanese leadership, "Japan cannot win a prolonged war. We must win quickly, or we will be strangled." By 1943, the strangulation was beginning. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 725,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. Painful but sustainable. Japan could replace those losses. In 1943, that number jumped to 1.8 million tons. Now Japan was losing ships faster than it could build replacements. In 1944, American submarines would sink 2.7 million tons. And by this point, Japan's shipbuilding industry was collapsing under American bombing raids. But raw tonnage figures don't tell the whole story. It was what was being sunk that mattered. Targeting the tankers. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval codes, allowing submarine commanders to know when convoys were sailing, what routes they would take, and, critically, what cargo they carried. Submarines began prioritizing tankers above all other targets. A 10,000-ton tanker carrying fuel oil from Borneo was worth far more than a 10,000-ton freighter carrying manufactured goods. And tankers were particularly vulnerable to submarine attack. When torpedoed, they often erupted in massive fireballs that could be seen for miles. Tanker crews had some of the highest casualty rates of any merchant sailors in any navy. USS Harder, under Commander Samuel Dealey, specialized in tanker hunting. On one patrol in June 1944, Harder sank 3 destroyers and 2 tankers in just 5 days. One of those tankers was carrying aviation fuel desperately needed for Japanese carriers preparing for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. That fuel never arrived, and Japanese carriers at the Philippine Sea would fight with partially trained pilots flying planes with limited fuel, one of many factors that turned the battle into what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Recognizing the growing submarine threat, Japanese Naval Command implemented a convoy system in late 1943. Merchant ships would sail in groups, protected by destroyers and subchasers. In theory, this should have reduced losses. In practice, it made targeting easier for American submarines. Instead of hunting scattered individual ships across thousands of miles of ocean, submarines could now wait along known convoy routes and attack concentrated groups of ships. One well-positioned submarine could sink 3 or 4 ships from a single convoy before the escorts could react. And American submarines had developed wolf pack tactics, multiple boats coordinating attacks on the same convoy. While escorts chased one submarine, 2 others would attack from different angles. USS Tang, USS Tenosa, and USS Trigger executed one of the most successful wolf pack operations in October 1944, intercepting a convoy of 20 ships traveling from Singapore to Japan. Over the course of 2 days, the 3 submarines sank 13 ships totaling over 90,000 tons. Only 7 ships from that convoy reached Japan, and 3 of those were so badly damaged they required months of repairs. For Japanese merchant sailors, submarine warfare became a nightmare. There was no warning, no time to prepare. One moment, a ship would be steaming peacefully. The next, torpedo explosions would tear through the hull, flooding compartments, starting fires, breaking the vessel in half. Most ships sank in minutes. Sailors trapped below decks had no chance of escape. Those who made it to the water faced miles of open ocean, often far from land with minimal survival gear. Japanese destroyers, desperately needed elsewhere, had to dedicate precious resources to rescuing survivors. Time spent fishing men from the water instead of escorting the next convoy. By 1944, Japanese merchant marine casualties exceeded combat deaths in the Japanese Army for several months. Being a merchant sailor had become one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire Japanese military. And American submarines showed no signs of slowing down. Wahoo's final hunt. Lieutenant Commander Mush Morton's USS Wahoo had become legendary by late 1943. 7 successful patrols. 20 ships sunk. Over 60,000 tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom. Morton's aggressive tactics had inspired an entire generation of submarine commanders. His patrol reports were studied at submarine school. His techniques were adopted fleet-wide. In October 1943, Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor for her 8th patrol. Her assigned hunting grounds, the Sea of Japan. The Sea of Japan was considered one of the most dangerous patrol areas in the Pacific. It was enclosed water, surrounded by the Japanese home islands, Korea, and Sakhalin. Minefields blocked most approaches. Japanese anti-submarine forces operated in strength. Escape routes were limited. Morton didn't care. The Sea of Japan was full of shipping, convoys moving between Japan, Korea, and Manchuria, believing themselves safe in home waters. Wahoo entered the Sea of Japan through La Parao Strait in early October. Within days, Morton found targets. On October 5th, Wahoo torpedoed and sank the freighter Conran Maru. On October 6th, she sank the passenger cargo ship Kanko Maru. By October 9th, Wahoo had sunk 4 ships totaling over 13,000 tons, right in Japan's backyard. But the Japanese Navy was hunting Wahoo now. Aircraft spotted her on the surface. Subchasers converged on her position. Minefields were activated. On October 11, 1943, Japanese aircraft attacked a surface submarine in La Parao Strait, the same strait Wahoo would use to exit the Sea of Japan. Depth charges were dropped. Oil slicks and debris surfaced. Wahoo never returned from patrol. All 80 men aboard, including Mush Morton, were lost. The submarine that had terrorized Japanese convoys for over a year was gone, but her legacy lived on. Morton's aggressive tactics had proven that submarines could dominate, not just harass. And dozens of other submarine commanders continued his work. In June 1944, USS Tang under Commander Richard O'Kane departed Pearl Harbor for her third war patrol. Her assigned area, the waters around the Japanese home islands. What followed was one of the most successful submarine patrols in history. Over 21 days, Tang sank 10 ships totaling over 39,000 tons. She attacked convoys in broad daylight. She fought surface actions against escorts. She penetrated harbors that Japanese commanders thought were too shallow and too well defended for submarine operations. On June 24th, Tang intercepted a 6-ship convoy off the coast of Honshu. O'Kane positioned Tang ahead of the convoy, then turned and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes into the leading ships. 3 ships exploded almost simultaneously. As escorts raced toward Tang's position, O'Kane calmly reloaded and fired another spread at the remaining ships. 2 more hits. 2 more ships began settling by the bow. The convoy scattered in panic. The 6th ship ran aground trying to escape. O'Kane surfaced Tang and finished off the grounded ship with gunfire, then withdrew before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. The entire engagement lasted less than 30 minutes. 6 ships destroyed or damaged, and Tang escaped without a scratch. When Tang returned to Pearl Harbor in July 1944, she had expended all 24 torpedoes and scored an astounding 24 hits. O'Kane's precision had achieved what other commanders could barely imagine: a 100% hit rate. Admiral Lockwood personally greeted Tang at the dock. O'Kane and his crew received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that could be awarded to an entire ship's company. But O'Kane wasn't done. Tang would complete 2 more patrols before her luck finally ran out in October 1944. The 5th patrol. Tang's 5th and final patrol began in September 1944. Her hunting grounds, Formosa Strait, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the Japanese Empire. O'Kane found targets immediately. On October 10th, Tang sank 2 cargo ships. On October 11th, she sank a tanker carrying aviation fuel. By October 23rd, Tang had sunk or damaged 13 ships, making this her most successful patrol yet. But that night, disaster struck. Tang had surfaced to attack a convoy in the Formosa Strait. O'Kane fired a spread of torpedoes at multiple targets. Several ships erupted in flames. Then Tang fired her last torpedo, number 24. Something went wrong. The torpedo's gyroscope malfunctioned. Instead of running straight, it curved hard to the left, directly back toward Tang. O'Kane ordered emergency speed. Tang's engines roared to full power, trying to outrun her own torpedo. It wasn't enough. The torpedo struck Tang's stern, detonating directly beneath the after torpedo room. The explosion tore open Tang's pressure hull and flooded the entire after section of the boat. Tang sank in seconds. Of the 87 men aboard, only 9 made it to the surface, including Commander O'Kane. They spent the night in the water, surrounded by burning Japanese ships from Tang's last attack, until Japanese patrol boats picked them up the next morning. O'Kane and his surviving crew spent the rest of the war as prisoners. But Tang's record spoke for itself. 5 patrols, 33 ships sunk, over 116,000 tons destroyed. No other American submarine in World War II would match that record. The fleet carries on. The loss of Wahoo and Tang were tragedies for the submarine service. But they were just 2 boats among more than 200 now operating in the Pacific. For every legendary boat lost, 2 more arrived from the shipyards. And every new submarine crew had learned from the tactics developed by Morton, O'Kane, and dozens of other aggressive commanders. By late 1944, American submarines controlled the Pacific. Japanese convoys could barely move without facing submarine attack. Critical war materials sat in warehouses across Southeast Asia because there weren't enough ships or enough brave sailors willing to risk the submarine-infested waters between the conquered territories and Japan. The strangulation that Yamamoto had feared was tightening around Japan's throat. By January 1945, Japan's situation had become desperate. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had dropped to 5% of 1941 levels. The oil that did arrive was often low-grade crude that Japanese refineries struggled to process into usable fuel. Rubber imports had ceased almost entirely. Japan's tire production collapsed. Military vehicles were immobilized for lack of tires. Aircraft were grounded because replacement tires couldn't be manufactured. Food imports from Southeast Asia, rice, fish, livestock, had dropped by 75%. Rationing became severe even for military personnel. Civilians in Japanese cities faced genuine starvation. Iron ore, copper, aluminum, and other strategic metals required for weapons production weren't arriving. Factories ran at partial capacity. Production of aircraft, tanks, and ships plummeted, not because of American bombing, but because the raw materials simply weren't available. And all of this was caused by American submarines. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk. 1,178 Japanese merchant ships totaling 5.3 million tons. 214 Japanese warships, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. Over 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war. To put that in perspective, the Japanese merchant fleet at the start of the war totaled about 6 million tons. By war's end, less than 1.5 million tons remained operational, and much of that was trapped in ports, too damaged to sail, or manned by crews too terrified to leave harbor. The submarine service accomplished this with just 288 boats that completed war patrols. Of those, 52 were lost, an 18% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of the American military. But that 2% of naval personnel sank more Japanese ships than all other American forces combined, surface ships, aircraft, and mines included. For Japanese merchant sailors, the casualty rate was catastrophic. Of the approximately 122,000 Japanese merchant seamen who served during the war, over 27,000 died, a 22% fatality rate. Thousands more were wounded or suffered severe trauma. By comparison, Japanese Army casualties in combat were approximately 15% overall. Being a merchant sailor was statistically more dangerous than being an infantry soldier on the front lines. Entire shipping companies lost their fleets. Families lost fathers, sons, and brothers. And the Japanese government struggled to find crews willing to man the few remaining ships. Historians debate what ultimately defeated Japan: the atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the island-hopping campaign, the strategic bombing offensive. But there's no debate about this. Without American submarines strangling Japan's economy, the war would have lasted longer and cost far more lives. Japan's aircraft production in 1945 was a fraction of 1,944 levels. Not because factories were bombed, but because aluminum and steel couldn't be delivered. Japan's navy was reduced to harbor defense, not because ships were sunk, but because fuel oil couldn't be transported from the Dutch East Indies. Japan's population faced starvation, not because farms stopped producing, but because imported food couldn't reach Japanese ports. Admiral Nagano's dismissive assessment in 1941, "Their submarines are a nuisance, nothing more," had proven catastrophically wrong. American submarines weren't a nuisance. They were Japan's executioner. The price of victory. The American submarine service paid a heavy price for its success. 52 submarines lost. 3,505 submariners killed. 374 crew members captured. The casualty rate, 18%, was the highest of any American service branch. Submarine duty was voluntary precisely because it was so dangerous. Every man who served knew the risks, but they also knew the importance of their mission. Every ship sunk was one less transport delivering troops to fight American soldiers. Every tanker destroyed was fuel that wouldn't power Japanese aircraft. Every carrier sent to the bottom was steel that wouldn't become bullets, bombs, or bayonets. The submarines earned their title, the Silent Service. They operated in secrecy, their victories often unknown until after the war. No crowds cheered when they left port. No headlines celebrated their returns. But they won the war. Several factors combined to make American submarines the most effective commerce raiders in naval history. Technology. By 1943, American submarines had reliable torpedoes, effective radar, and sophisticated fire control systems. Japanese anti-submarine technology never caught up. Intelligence. Breaking Japanese codes allowed submarines to intercept convoys, avoid patrols, and target high-value ships like tankers and troop transports. Training. American submarine crews were highly educated, intensively trained, and given significant tactical autonomy. Commanders were encouraged to be aggressive and innovative. Numbers. Building 288 submarines allowed the U.S. to maintain constant pressure on Japanese shipping lanes. When one boat returned to port, 2 more were on station. Doctrine. The shift from cautious, conservative tactics to aggressive commerce raiding transformed the submarine force from ineffective to dominant. Industrial capacity. Unlimited torpedoes, fuel, and spare parts meant American submarines could sustain operations at a tempo Japanese forces couldn't match. The Japanese perspective. After the war, Japanese naval officers were interviewed about what factors most contributed to Japan's defeat. Many cited the submarine campaign as critical, perhaps even decisive. Captain Atsushi Oi, a Japanese naval staff officer, wrote, "I can state without hesitation that the principal factor in our defeat was the destruction of merchant shipping by American submarines." Admiral Osamu Nagano, the same admiral who dismissed American submarines as a nuisance in 1941, told American interrogators in 1945, "Your submarines strangled us. We could not move materials. We could not supply our forces. We could not feed our people. The submarines defeated us before the bombs ever fell." It was a remarkable admission from a man who had underestimated American capabilities so badly. The Pacific submarine campaign remains studied today at naval academies worldwide. The lessons are clear. Control of sea lanes is essential for island nations and resource-dependent economies. Technology matters, but training, doctrine, and leadership matter more. Quantity has a quality all its own. Even technologically inferior forces can win if they achieve numerical superiority. Commerce warfare can be as strategically decisive as fleet actions. And perhaps most importantly, never underestimate your enemy's capacity to adapt, improve, and innovate. Japanese admirals made that mistake in 1941. By the time they realized their error, it was too late. The Submarine Memorial at Pearl Harbor lists the names of the 52 American submarines lost during World War II. Each name represents not just a boat, but 60 to 80 men who never came home. Wahoo, Tang, Harder, Growler, Sculpin, Grunion. These boats and their crews wrote one of the most remarkable chapters in naval history. A story of adaptation, courage, and relentless determination. They transformed from a force that Japanese admirals mocked into the weapon that brought an empire to its knees. They proved that warfare isn't just about who has the biggest guns or the most ships. It's about who can adapt faster, innovate better, and sustain operations longer. Admiral Nagano learned that lesson too late. His dismissive words in 1941, "Their submarines are a nuisance, nothing more," would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because American submarines were far more than a nuisance. They were silent, deadly, and utterly unstoppable. They sank 55% of Japan's merchant fleet. They strangled an empire. They won a war. And they did it from beneath the waves, unseen and unheralded, until the very end. If you found this video engaging, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the untold stories of World War II. Let me know in the comments which submarine story you'd like to hear next. There are dozens more we haven't covered,